On the 14th of July, 1518, a woman stepped into a street in Strasbourg and started dancing. There was no music. There was no festival, no wedding, no holiday. She just started dancing in the middle of the road, outside her own front door. And she didn't stop. She danced until she collapsed. Then she got up and danced again. Her feet swelled, her shoes filled with blood. Within a week, 34 other people were doing it too. Within a month, 400. So the city of Strasbourg looked at 400 citizens dancing themselves into the ground and took decisive action. They decided the problem was that these people weren't dancing enough. They cleared out 2 guild halls. They built stages in the horse market and the grain market. And they hired a band. All of this is in the records. And it is somehow worse than it sounds. Strasbourg in 1518 is a rich, crowded, free city on the Rhine. Its cathedral has the tallest spire on earth and will keep that record for another 300 years. Underneath it, things are going badly. The harvests have failed. Grain prices have gone straight up. There are beggars sleeping in the streets in numbers nobody can remember seeing. Syphilis has just arrived in Europe and nobody understands it. Plague and leprosy are permanent background features of life. So, a hungry, frightened, extremely religious city on a very hot July day. The chronicles call her Frau Trophaea. We know almost nothing about her. Not her age, not her first name, not what became of her. We know that she walked out of her house on a narrow cobbled street and began to dance, not happily. Witnesses describe the dancers as blank-faced, sweating, thrashing, eyes somewhere else. Several of them later begged people to make it stop. Her husband came out and asked her to come inside. She kept dancing. She danced through the afternoon. She danced into the evening. A crowd formed, because a crowd always forms. She danced for somewhere between 4 and 6 days. And then the second person started. Then a third. By the end of the week, there were 34 of them. Same streets, same movements, still no music. Now, a modern city would have a plan for this. Strasbourg had a city council, and the council had a procedure. The procedure was, ask the doctors. So they asked the doctors. This was the mistake. The physicians of Strasbourg examined the outbreak and came back with a diagnosis. And in fairness to them, they started well. They ruled out demons. They ruled out witchcraft. They ruled out the planets, which for 1518 is a genuinely progressive medical opinion. Their conclusion was that this was, quote, a natural disease which comes from overheated blood, which is standard medicine for the time. The body holds 4 fluids, and health means keeping them balanced. Too much blood, and the blood gets hot, and the hot blood has to go somewhere. Normally you would open a vein and let some out, but these patients were already moving constantly and sweating it out. So the physicians decided the treatment was already happening on its own. The dancing wasn't the disease. The dancing was the cure. The patients simply had to finish. So the official medical advice to a city full of people collapsing in the street was, keep dancing, day and night, until the fever burns itself out. This is the medical equivalent of putting out a fire with wood, and the council did not argue. They had asked the experts. These were the experts. The experts had spoken, so Strasbourg committed completely. If the cure is dancing, the city will supply dancing, professionally, at scale, with infrastructure. The council ordered the Carpenters' Guild to clear out its hall, then the Tanners' Guild. Both were converted into dance floors. Then they went further. Daniel Specklin, the city architect, recorded that the council had platforms built in the horse market and the grain market, open-air stages in the two busiest public squares in the city. Then they hired musicians, dozens of them, drums, fiddles, pipes, and horns paid out of public money. And because the dancers kept falling over, they hired professional dancers as well, strong, healthy, paid dancers, whose job was to hold the sick ones upright and keep them moving. I want to be clear about what Strasbourg has now built. In a food crisis, the city has built 2 public stages, staffed them with a live band, and put its sickest citizens on them in the town centre. All day, every day, free entry, and people came to watch. Of course they did. And this is where the plan meets the actual problem, because the crowd watching 30 people convulse to a live drum did not see a medical treatment. They saw a punishment. They saw what happens when St Vitus is angry with you. St Vitus, everyone in the Rhineland knew, could strike a person down with a dance they could not control. It was a known curse, and people had feared it for over 100 years. And the city had just installed a live demonstration of it in the main square, with a band. The dancing spread. 34 became 50. 50 became 100. The Imlin family chronicle records that within a month the plague had taken 400 citizens. The cure was working perfectly, in completely the wrong direction. And then people started dying. The chronicles say dancers were dropping from heart attacks, strokes, and exhaustion, and one number gets repeated everywhere: 15 deaths a day. That number is not in the city's own records. The surviving council orders and accounts do not record a single death from the dancing. The 15 a day comes from chronicles written down later, and historians treat it carefully. What is not in doubt is that people were being carried out of the squares. The council's confidence collapsed, because the Privy Council now did something governments almost never do. They admitted the plan was wrong, out loud, in writing. The stages came down, the guild halls were closed, and then Strasbourg banned dancing. Not just for the sick, for everybody, in the whole city, until September. In a culture where dancing together was the main thing anyone did for fun, they made it illegal. There was exactly one exception. Honourable persons could still dance at a wedding or a religious feast, but only to stringed instruments. No drums, no tambourines. The city council had formally decided that percussion was a public health risk. 3 weeks earlier, they were paying drummers by the hour. The dancing didn't stop, though, so the council tried the only other option it had. If St Vitus sent this, then St Vitus can take it back. The worst affected were loaded into wagons. They were driven about 30 miles into the hills to a shrine in a grotto above the town of Saverne. It took days. At the shrine, the priests carried out a very specific ritual, and the details were recorded. The dancers were laid down in front of a wooden carving of the saint. Small wooden crosses were put into their hands. Red shoes were put onto their ruined feet. The shoes were sprinkled with holy water, and crosses of holy oil were painted onto the tops and the soles of them. There was incense, and a mass said in Latin over people who had been dancing for a month, and it worked. Not instantly, But the pilgrims recovered, word came back to the city, and by early September the dancing plague of 1518 was over. 2 months, 400 people, one municipal band. 8 years later, a physician called Paracelsus rode into Strasbourg to look into it. Paracelsus is one of the genuinely important figures in the history of medicine. His considered professional verdict was that Frau Trophäa started dancing to annoy her husband. That is the theory. She was cross with her husband, so she danced for 6 days, and 400 people joined in. He then invented 3 separate categories of dancing disease, gave them Latin names, and left. Modern medicine has 2 better ideas. The popular one is ergot. Ergot is a fungus that grows on damp rye, and it contains compounds related to LSD. A wet year, mouldy bread, and a whole town could genuinely be poisoned. Very neat, except that ergot poisoning does not do this. It causes convulsions and it chokes the blood supply to your hands and feet. The medieval name for it was St Anthony's fire. People whose feet are dying do not dance for 6 days. And a fungus in the bread does not explain why it spread to people who only stood and watched. The explanation most historians now accept belongs to the historian John Waller. Everybody in Strasbourg already believed St Vitus could do exactly this. That belief was centuries old, and there had been at least 10 outbreaks along the Rhine and the Moselle since 1374. This was a known illness with known symptoms that everyone in the city could describe. Then you take a city that is starving and frightened and add extreme stress. Under enough of it, people can enter genuine trance states, and the body produces the illness the mind expects. This is not faking. The dancers were not pretending. Their feet really did bleed. The disease was already sitting in everybody's head, and a terrible year let it out, which means the worst thing you could possibly do is put the afflicted on a raised stage in the main square with a drum and let the whole city watch. Strasbourg did that for about 3 weeks. It also explains the shrine. Red shoes and holy oil are not medicine. But if the illness is made of belief, then a cure made of belief is exactly the right size for it. The dancers believed they had been cursed. Then they believed they had been forgiven. The council's second plan worked because it was aimed at the actual disease. The first plan was aimed at the blood. Frau Trophäa disappears from the record completely. We do not know if she recovered. We do not know if she ever went home. The last certain thing anybody wrote about her is that she danced, and her husband asked her to stop, and she did not stop. The morale, I suppose, is that when 400 people are doing something alarming, the correct response is almost never to build them a stage. Subscribe. Or don't. Strasbourg had a plan too.